Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Jay and welcome to the Ship Life. So just to give all of you a quick heads up before we get started, this video is going to contain a lot of details and a lot of topics that some of you may seem irrelevant or the video itself might seem kind of tedious. However, I do want to give you guys a full breakdown with everything regarding the crew. But before I do, if you guys are just joining this video and you didn't see my video that I put out earlier this morning in regards to more NCL cancellations and update with the CDC, the director of the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, essentially conceding and saying that the cruise lines overall are doing a good job. And we also have boosters that are now going to be required in a port of call. Make sure you check out that video and then come back to this one. Now for this video, guys, I am going to be talking about the crew. By that I mean we're going to be talking about what's going on the quarantine ships, crew members being transferred, their mental health on board the ship, staff shortages, stuff of that nature, and as well potential layoffs that are taking place right now when it comes to cruising operations. Now, what's going on with cruise lines? So we do know that unfortunately there are a lot of cases taking place. Well, a lot. By that I mean usually around like 1% at the most as far as the overall whole guest and crew on board ships, but we are seeing a lot of cases among the crew more so than the guest. So we have cruise lines like Royal Caribbean, for example. They have created quarantine ships. To my knowledge, Royal Caribbean was the first one. At this point in time, we do have Vision of the Seas, Rhapsody of the Seas, and I told you guys earlier last week that Jewel of the Seas will become the third quarantine ship for Royal Caribbean. For Carnival, I am receiving information that the Carnival Sensation is going to be, at this point in time, one of the quarantine ships for Carnival Cruise Lines. And then we have NCL that did follow suit with Royal Caribbean before Carnival even did it, and they now have smaller ships that they are transferring COVID positive crew members over to. For NCL, we have the Oceania Regatta, and we also have Regent 7 Seas, Navigator. Now these are subsidiaries and they are more of the fancier cruise ships, fancier lines for NCL within the NCL umbrella. Now if you're looking at MSC, they are taking their crew members and putting them into quarantine hotels. This is due to the fact that over here in the United States, MSC hasn't exactly expanded out. They don't have a massive fleet of ships that are circulating and are in operation here in US waters. We also have Celebrity Cruise Lines, which is a subsidiary of Royal Caribbean, so they are pretty much one and the same. However, Celebrity is doing things differently from Royal Caribbean. To my knowledge, Celebrity is taking their crew members that are COVID positive and putting them into quarantine hotels. Now, why they aren't putting them over with the Royal Group, I have no idea. As far as Disney Cruise Lines, well, they are as quiet as a mouse. I have no idea what's going on with Disney. I know there are cases on board their ships, just like pretty much every ship that is operating in US waters. However, they are pretty tight-lipped on everything that's going on. However, that's kind of normal when it comes to Disney. Now, before we dive into this video, I do want to let everybody know, like I said, there's going to be a ton of information that I'm going to be going over. However, in the event that you are looking for a specific topic, I am going to put like chapters and tick marks somewhere in this general vicinity. You can just click on it and go to a certain part of the video. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I continuously see content creators, commenters on my videos and other videos and all over social media platforms that the crew members are perfectly fine, every single one of them. And when they quarantine, it's only for like 5 days. So what the heck is the big deal about? They quarantine, they get back on the ship. No, honestly, guys, it is a lot deeper than that. However, I do want to put a disclaimer out there. Everything that I'm going to talk about in today's video is not going to regard every single crew member. Every single crew member has their own situation. Every cruise line has their own situation. Every ship right now in this crazy pandemic environment is going through its own kind of thing. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying this is going on globally as far as the cruise ship industry. Now, one thing that I want to touch on is why in the heck are there so many cases on board? This is like the #1 question that keeps getting asked amongst all the crew members and everybody on social media, as well as guests that sail on board cruise ships. Well, a big reason that everybody is kind of concluding is that most of the crew members have been vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Why the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Well, at the time, you know, when vaccines started to become available, everybody needed them. And trying to get hands on the 2 shots for everybody for Pfizer, Moderna, at that time was almost impossible to guarantee the shipment and that their wait times and everything else that factored into all the crew members getting vaccinated. Because obviously, you know, with the cruise ship industry, there are quick turnaround times, similar like an airline. The cruise ships have to be up and running, and then once they start going, they don't stop. They go to the home port, they drop off passengers, they pick up more passengers, and they go on about their merry way. So the cruise lines have to act fast for the great cruise ship restart that we saw last summer back in 2021. So the Johnson & Johnson it was easy to distribute. However, it was the least effective vaccine. So this could be a probable reason as to why we are seeing more and more crew members test positive. However, thankfully, those that have tested positive, because there's been a decent amount of them, they've all, according to the cruise lines, have been asymptomatic. So let's move into the COVID procedures and isolation policies that are currently on board cruise ships, and then we'll sail into the conditions in which the crew members have to endure while on board cruise ships, especially during isolation, whether they be isolating on their ship that they're working on or they've been transferred to a quarantine ship. So essentially what's happening is, as per the CDC, if somebody tests positive for COVID, at this point in time with their new update, you have to quarantine for at least 5 days if you are asymptomatic. Now, it could be anywhere from 5 to 10 days depending on how the cruise lines are doing it. Every cruise line is obviously going to do it different because they are their own company, and the CDC guidelines is just that, it's guidelines, so they can do what they want in order to ensure the safety of all their guests and crew members that are on board. So anyway, with the crew members, like I said, we are seeing more crew members test positive than the guests because of the close quarters and proximity that they are on board cruise ships. Most of you guests or passengers that have been on ships, you usually see a spacious area, especially during this pandemic time, not a lot of guests. However, down below in the crew area, it is tight quarters. Everybody is pretty close to one another. So there is the potential for one person getting it and then another person getting it, so on and so forth. You get the idea. Now, we've seen this particularly with the entertainment. Basically, what will happen is if the entertainer that's doing shows with another entertainer tests positive for COVID, they are now listed as close contacts, and it is very likely in some cases that people are testing positive amongst the rest of the entertainers. This is why you're seeing shows that are out, because I've explained this before when it comes to the entertainers. Usually if you see one person in a show, they might be working in other shows, or at least some of the other entertainers within that show are also going to be working in other shows. So you get my point here. But basically what will happen is you have these crew members that are being isolated in the rooms, and you guys have seen, even with the guests, with how they are treated, you got basically these bag lunches that are being dropped off in the hallways, which I'll explain a little bit more in depth in a minute. But then you got crew members that are being transferred. Now, one thing that I'm seeing is a lot of people are saying, well, they're only going to isolate for 5 days and then the cruise ship is going to pick them up, right? Not necessarily. You got to take into the factors that the cruise lines have a logistics team, right? People are setting up these cruises. It's not like the cruise ship is saying, we're going to leave you here for 5 days to isolate and we're going to circle back around and pick you up. For example, we do have Royal Caribbean's Perfect Day at Coco Cay. That is kind of like the rendezvous point, the drop off and pickup zone for Royal Caribbean. However, you look at Carnival, you look at NCL, to my knowledge, they don't have a set point. So it just determines whether the cruise ship is going to go back to that area. If somebody's sailing on Symphony of the Seas or working on Symphony of the Seas, rather, there is no guarantee that the ship is going to be back there next week. Now, we are seeing, thankfully, at Royal Caribbean, for example, a lot of cruise ships, because we are seeing their ships getting denied in ports of call, they're kind of rerouting over to Perfect Day at Coco Cay. But again, there is no guarantee, no set determined amount if they're going to be isolated on that quarantine ship. Again, be it any of the quarantine ships that Royal Caribbean has, that the ship is going to turn around within 5 days and pick all these people up. I hope you get what I'm saying here. So moving on to the current living conditions of the crew members that are on board ships right now. Now, this does include crew members that are still on their ships that they're working on, that they're isolating in, and the ones that are on quarantine cruise ships at this point in time. The problem with all of this is that we've all seen that even among the guests, if you guys are on any Facebook groups, any forums, anything of that nature, we've seen the potential horror stories of guests that are saying they aren't getting food when they're saying they're going to get it. They're not getting water. They're kind of being just kind of left to the side, and they're not really getting any assistance while they're doing their isolation during their cruise. It's kind of like a nightmare, so to speak, for a lot of the guests. Now, you got to take into consideration, if this is happening with the guests, which are the #1 priority, what do you think is happening with the crew? I do want to put the disclaimer out there once again, guys. I don't think the cruise lines are technically at fault. They're doing what they can. However, with the shortage of staff, because people are getting sick and are getting quarantined and whatnot, they have to adjust to the best of their ability. So you have crew members that are testing positive and they get isolated on board the ship, and then they are supposed to be taken care of just like the guests, so to speak. They still have to be fed, they still need food and all this stuff, right? But when they go over to the quarantine ship, one thing you gotta understand is that the crew members are literally away from home. And whenever we get to our cabin when we're working on the ship, it is essentially our home away from home. We try to decorate it, at least I did, and everybody that I know, they try to put homey touches on board in their cabin. That way they don't feel like they're like just away from everything and that they're essentially in a prison. Now, when I say prison, I'm not saying the cruise ship working on board is like a prison. However, if you don't do something to kind of maybe, make yourself a little bit more at home, mentally it can drain you, which I will explain in a minute. But anyway, getting over to the transfer of crew members onto quarantine ships, you gotta think some of these crew members are transferring from bigger, nicer, newer ships with decent Wi-Fi to going to these dusty old cruise ships that have not had paying passengers on board. So meaning to a certain extent, a lot of these rooms have not been upkept. They're also going to rooms that are interior cabins and non-balconies due to the air filtration system on board. And then they have things like, oh, they can't go get their lunch, they can't go get food when they want to. They have set times. Like for example, on the quarantine ships, they have set times where they have at least 30 to 45 minutes to go to the Windjammer and get food. However, they do have set times depending on their department. But the problem with that is, a friend of mine was telling me that even if you include everything like walking time, she said, so it kind of rounds out to about 15 minutes or so, 15-20 minutes, where you can go get food and then you have to go back into isolation. Guys, you gotta understand that could be extremely draining for a lot of people. And once again, they're in these dusty old rooms. The Wi-Fi itself is a problem, and even when I worked on board cruise ships, you do have to pay for Wi-Fi. Now, I was told that at one point in time, the Wi-Fi was free on board the quarantine ships up until New Year's Eve, where they could have free Wi-Fi between 11 p.m. and I believe it was 8 a.m. Everything in between that, they actually had to pay for. Now, the crew members are, of course, still getting paid at this point in time, but you gotta think, guys, that stuff adds up. When I was working for NCL, I believe it was like 20 bucks for 120 minutes, and obviously that's not taken away with me just trying to get a hold to somebody to make the call because the signal is trash. So with all this craziness in mind, try to think of the overall mental state of the crew members that are currently on board cruise ships. Remember, there are some crew members that have a little bit more of mental stability than others. However, I always say that there is not a single person in the world that is completely immune to mental stress. Again, these people are away from their families, their friends, and some of them do potentially have trauma from the big shutdown that happened back in 2020, in which they were stuck on board cruise ships anywhere from like 2, 3, up to 6 months before they got to go home. And there were a lot of things that were taking place and things that they weren't being told, in which they were like, okay, well, when am I gonna go home? Some of them were hearing they were going home tomorrow, then it got canceled the next day, so on and so forth. But you get what I'm saying here. These crew members could be looking at this and they're saying, okay, well, I've been completely fine, and all of a sudden I'm told that I'm testing positive for COVID, and now I'm being forced to go to this quarantine cruise ship away from all of my stuff, and now this is the situation that I'm dealing with. You gotta understand that these crew members are also humans too, and they're also people. Like I said, this is not everybody, but I'm hearing things constantly of crew members saying, well, you know, I think I want to quit. There are also crew members that are getting laid off and stuff, which I'll talk about in a minute, because at the end of the day, these are people with feelings, and obviously, even though you as a guest, because I'm assuming that's the vast majority of the people that are watching these videos, they assume, again, it's just a week. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. I keep hearing this and I'm like, guys, you have to have some type of compassion at the end of the day, because you're gonna like try to swing it in some form of ignorance and say that, oh, well, you know, this is what they signed up for. This is not what the crew members signed up for. At the end of the day, being stuck in a room with no windows, told when you can eat, crappy Wi-Fi, not being able to communicate, and you're in there alone because everybody's being isolated by themselves, you can see where the problem is. We as humans are social creatures, and without being able to be social, well, we have a problem. A lot of psychological issues could come from all of this. Now, just getting into everything as far as the staff shortages and the layoffs, people keep saying, oh, there is no staff shortage, there is no staff shortage. While some of it and most of it may be temporary with the shortages, because unfortunately we have kind of like a revolving door. You have crew members that are getting sick, which are getting more crew members sick, which then have to go to the quarantine ships, which then have to go to the quarantine hotels, so on and so forth. But coming out of that, guys, you have crew members that are going through this stuff, like I said, with the trauma and everything, and they're like, you know what, what's the point of being here right now? I think I just want to go home. There's like you have crew members that are indeed quitting. I promise you, this is actually happening right now. Now, as far as the people quitting, I want to say they are kind of like far and in between. Not everybody is just walking away from the job, because at the end of the day, the crew members have to endure it, because for a lot of them coming from places like the Philippines and developing countries, this is the best money that they are ever going to make. So they got to kind of tough it out and just deal with it. Now, on the flip side of that, from a business standpoint, the cruise lines also have to do what they have to do. As we've seen a giant round of cancellations by Royal Caribbean and NCL, even more cancellations earlier today, they are going to do everything they can to essentially knock off any additional costs that they can. And one thing I've learned about being an entertainer is that the first thing to go is usually entertainment, even though this is kind of like the premise and the basis for being able to go on a ship. You get entertained, you get to kind of be away from the reality, whether you're in a port of call or if you're on board the ship. Now, you have crew members that unfortunately are kind of like toward or nearing the end of their contract, and the cruise lines are using this opportunity to somewhat clean house and bring in a fresh batch of crew members. This is happening because because we don't know. Just like in 2020, remember there were all these travel restrictions, travel bans. They figure right now, while they are canceling a lot of these cruises, having a brief pause or a partial pause in operation, they're going to bring in a new batch of crew members with new fresh contracts, and those that maybe haven't been through too much, that way they can carry out and do the duties that needed to be fulfilled on board cruise ships. This is something that's happening across all different cruise lines, primarily over here in the US, but who's to say it's not happening overseas? Now, please keep in mind that also while you have crew members that do want to leave and discontinue their contract, cruise lines are also getting crew members to go home early so they can bring in a fresh batch of people. You also have crew members that are transferring. You have crew members that are on their way over to cruise ships, which unfortunately during this pandemic era has become a very tedious process with the travel restrictions, all the quarantines that crew members have to do because they have to quarantine at home before they go over to the next country where the ship is home ported at. Then they have to quarantine before they get on the ship, so on and so forth. It is a giant process. But just to bring all this home, guys, I just want to make it clear that obviously, like I said, this is not the cruise line's fault. They're doing everything they can. And I'm not trying to make this some doom and gloom situation. But me, as a former crew member, I am constantly talking with crew members left and right and just hearing all the things that I hear. And then when I see other people on social media talking about, oh, they just need to suck it up and deal with it, I'm not going to lie to you. It kind of bothers me because at the end of the day, isn't this whole pandemic about helping others and making sure everybody else is safe and making sure everybody else gets to live to see another day and enjoy life when all this is over? Then you have people on the flip side saying, well, the crew members know what they signed up for. I'm not trying to make this a rant. I just want everybody to be aware because I do believe transparency and awareness is more important above just about everything, especially during this pandemic when people aren't really being transparent. But I'm going to leave this right here, guys. I know there was a ton of stuff we went over in this video, and I apologize if it's all over the place. I hope most of you understand all of this. If you enjoyed this video, of course, you can comment. Let me know your thoughts about everything that I talked about in this video. I may make it part 2 because there's so much other things that I could have brought up. This video is probably going to end up being like 15, 20 minutes long. I apologize for that, guys. But of course, on your way out, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, very important. I have more videos coming out. And of course, share this video goes a long way in support of my channel. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take it easy.